Some of the things I was doing in the world, I've been a gang member all my life. And so I'm like on a collision course for death out there and not caring. I think that if I would have never came to death row, I wouldn't be the individual I am today. I wouldn't be as mature. I wouldn't be able to explain to my daughter's life, like the appreciation of it, because I didn't have any appreciation for life. I wouldn't be able to explain to them that there's a world out there and not just a city, you know.
There are questions that don't have clean answers, and this is one of them. Can a man who commits unspeakable evil truly change? And if he does that change matter when the blood has already been spilled? Christopher Anthony Young's story forces you to choose a side, and no matter which one you pick, someone will call you wrong. On the morning of November 21st, 2004, a mother woke up to a nightmare she would never fully escape. Christopher Young broke into her apartment in San Antonio, Texas, and sexually assaulted her while her 3 young children were somewhere in that same space. Close enough to hear, close enough to sense that something terrible was happening to their mother. DNA evidence would later confirm what she already knew. The man who violated her was a stranger, fueled by drugs, alcohol, and a mind that had stopped seeing people as human. When he was done, he forced her into her own car at gunpoint and drove off with her still inside. At a stoplight, she made a choice that saved her life. She opened the door and ran into traffic, screaming for help, leaving him alone in the stolen vehicle. 1 block away, Hasmukh Patel was opening his small convenience store, the Mini Food Mart, just as he did every Sunday morning. He was 53 years old, an immigrant who had come to America searching for safety and a future for his family. He believed in hard work, in peace, in the quiet dignity of serving his community. That store wasn't just a business. It was proof that his sacrifice had meant something. But at around 10:30 a.m., Christopher Young walked through the door. Surveillance cameras captured every second. Words were exchanged. Then Christopher raised his gun. The first shot hit Patel in the hand as he tried to shield himself. The second tore through his chest. He fell behind the counter, gasping, bleeding, dying. Christopher didn't take any money. He didn't rob the register. He just turned and walked out, leaving a man to die on the floor of his own dream. 90 minutes later, police found Christopher at a crack house with a prostitute, still sitting in the stolen car, his face wet with tears and sweat. When they cuffed him, he didn't fight. He confessed almost immediately. He said he didn't even remember pulling the trigger. He said he was drunk, high, lost. He said he was sorry. But sorry doesn't bring back the dead. Sorry doesn't heal the mother who had to explain to her children why a stranger hurt her. And in Texas, sorry doesn't stop the machine once it starts moving. Fast forward 14 years. July 16th, 2018. Christopher Young, now 34 years old, lies on a thin bunk in the Pulaski unit, Texas's death row facility, staring at a ceiling he's memorized down to every crack and stain. Less than 24 hours remain before the state will strap him to a gurney and pump chemicals into his veins until his heart stops. His 3 daughters visited him earlier that day. They are 17 and 13 now, old enough to understand that their father is about to be killed, not by accident or illness, but by the government. They held his hands through the bars. They cried. He told them to be better than him, to stay in school, to choose differently. Then they left, and he returned to his cell, to wait for death. That same morning, the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles delivered their decision. Clemency denied. It was unanimous. No mercy, no second chance. His lawyers had filed motion after motion, arguing that the system was rigged by race, that Christopher had been a model inmate for over a decade, that even the son of the man he killed had met with him and left the meeting in tears. They pointed to a case from just 7 months earlier. Thomas Whitaker, a white man who had hired hitmen to murder his entire family, killing his mother and brother while his father barely survived. The same parole board had unanimously recommended clemency for Whitaker. His sentence was commuted to life in prison. Christopher's lawyers stood in front of judges and asked the question that burned through every filing. Why does a white man who killed his family get mercy, while a black man who killed a stranger gets death? The courts had no answer that satisfied anyone. Federal judges admitted they were troubled, but said they had no legal authority to intervene. The system, they said, had spoken, and in Texas, the system doesn't often change its mind. Now, as the clock ticks toward his execution, Christopher lies in the dark, remembering everything. The boy he was before his father was murdered when he was 8. The teenager who joined the Bloods because it felt like the only family left. The young man who traded a future in music and chess for corners and guns. The 21-year-old who walked into a store high, broken, and dangerous and destroyed a life in seconds. And then the man he became in prison. The one who mentored other inmates, who stopped violence before it started, who wrote letters to at-risk youth warning them not to make his mistakes. He is both men at once, the monster and the mentor, and the state of Texas has decided that only one of them matters. The needle is ready. The witnesses are gathering. And the question hanging over everything is this: if a man truly changes, if he becomes someone worthy of forgiveness, does it matter? Or is redemption just a word we use to make ourselves feel better, while the machinery of death grinds forward no matter what? Most people who tell Christopher Young's story skip over the worst part. They talk about the murder. They talk about redemption. But they leave out the horror that came before the gunshot, the part that makes forgiveness almost impossible to imagine. That Sunday morning didn't start with Hasmukh Patel. It started with a woman and her 3 children asleep in their apartment, unaware that a stranger was about to shatter their lives in a way that would never fully heal. Christopher Young, 21 years old, high on cocaine and soaked in alcohol, wasn't stumbling through the streets by accident. He was hunting. He broke into her home. Not for money, not for anything that made sense, but because something inside him had turned dark and vicious. While her children were close enough to hear, close enough to feel the terror in the air, he sexually assaulted her. DNA evidence later confirmed what she already knew in her bones. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't confusion. It was violence, deliberate and cruel. When he was finished, he forced her into her own car at gunpoint and drove away with her trapped beside him. She didn't know if she would live or die. Her children didn't know if they would ever see their mother again. But at a stoplight, with traffic moving around them and the world continuing as if nothing had happened, she made a choice. She threw open the door and ran, her feet hitting the pavement, her voice breaking as she screamed for help. Drivers stared. Some stopped. Christopher didn't chase her. He kept the car and kept moving, as if the woman he had just violated was nothing more than an obstacle he had cleared. 1 block away, Hasmukh Patel was unlocking the door to his convenience store, the mini food mart. He was 53 years old, a father, an immigrant who had crossed oceans and borders to build something honest and small in a country that promised safety. His store wasn't fancy. It didn't make him rich, but it was his and the people in the neighborhood knew him, trusted him, depended on him. He turned on the lights, checked the register, and prepared for another quiet Sunday. He had no idea that the man who had just destroyed one life was already walking toward his door. Surveillance footage captured it all. Christopher entered the store, his movements jerky and unfocused. Words were exchanged, though no one will ever know exactly what was said. Then, without warning, Christopher raised his gun. Patel's hands went up instinctively, trying to shield himself, trying to stop what couldn't be stopped. The first bullet tore through his hand. The second ripped into his chest. He collapsed behind the counter, his breath shallow, his blood spreading across the floor. Christopher didn't grab money from the register. He didn't ransack the shelves. He just stood there for a moment, staring at what he had done, and then he turned and walked out, leaving Patel to die alone in the store he had built with his own hands. 90 minutes later, police found Christopher at a crack house on the other side of the city. He was sitting in the stolen car with a prostitute, his face slick with sweat, his eyes red and wet with tears. When officers approached, he didn't run. He didn't resist. He just sat there, shaking, as if the weight of what he had done had finally caught up to him. In the interrogation room, he confessed almost immediately. He said he didn't remember firing the gun. He said he was drunk, high, lost. He said he was sorry. But the evidence didn't care about his apology. The DNA confirmed the rape. The surveillance footage confirmed the murder. And Texas made one thing very clear. Christopher Anthony Young would pay with his life. Then came the twist that no one expected. In prison, something inside Christopher Young broke open, not in the way violence breaks a person, but in the way truth does. He wasn't the same man anymore. At first, he tried to hold on to his old identity, the gang member, the hardened criminal, the man who didn't flinch. But death row doesn't work like that. It strips you down to nothing and forces you to look at who you really are. And what Christopher saw horrified him. He met another inmate named Reginald Blanton, a man who had walked the same streets, carried the same pain, but had found a way to think differently. Reginald gave him a book, a thin, quiet thing called As a Man Thinketh. Christopher read it once, then again, then again. The message was simple, but devastating. Your thoughts shape your life. Everything he had become, every choice that led him to that store, to that gun, to that moment, had started in his own mind. And if that was true, then maybe, just maybe, he could change the ending by changing the way he thought. He started small. He stopped fighting. He started reading. He began mentoring younger inmates, talking them down from violence, helping them see past the anger that had swallowed him whole. He wrote a curriculum for at-risk youth, a program designed to pull kids away from the gang life before it was too late. Guards noticed the change. Other inmates respected him. He became a peacemaker in one of the most dangerous places in America, a man who used his voice to stop the kind of destruction he had once caused. He became a father again. Not through visits, but through letters and phone calls to his 3 daughters. He told them to stay in school, to choose love over rage, to be better than he ever was. For more than a decade, Christopher Young lived as a different man, not pretending, not performing, actually changed. Guards who worked death row for years said he was one of the most reliable, thoughtful inmates they had ever seen. Other prisoners said he saved lives, talked people out of suicide, stopped fights before they started. He wasn't asking for freedom. He knew he couldn't undo what he had done, but he wanted his life, whatever was left of it, to mean something. Texas didn't care. The state doesn't measure who you become. It only punishes who you were. And in the eyes of the law, Christopher Young was still the man who raped a mother in front of her children and murdered a store owner in cold blood. Redemption, no matter how real, doesn't erase a crime. Change, no matter how deep, doesn't bring back the dead. And so the countdown continued, slow and inevitable, toward the day when the state would strap him to a table and stop his heart, not because of the man he had become, but because of the boy he used to be. On death row, time doesn't just pass. It presses on you, strips you, forces you to face yourself with nowhere to run. When Christopher Young first arrived, he carried the same armor he'd worn on the streets: anger, pride, gang loyalty, the belief that violence was the only language anyone truly respected. He expected a battlefield, sets, politics, stabbings in the dark. Instead, he found something far more dangerous to a man like him: silence. 23 hours a day in a concrete box with nothing but his own thoughts, no corners to claim, no crowd to impress, just the echo of everything he'd done. In that silence, he met a man who would change him more than any judge or preacher ever had. His name was Reginald Blanton. Reg came from the same kind of streets, carried the same kind of scars, but there was something different about him. He wasn't loud. He wasn't trying to prove how hard he was. He moved with a calm that felt almost out of place in a place built for death. Through doors and vents, through short conversations and shared moments, a connection formed. One day, when Christopher asked for something to read, Reg didn't slide over a street novel or a prison drama. He pushed a thin, old-fashioned book toward him. As a Man Thinketh. At first glance, it didn't look like much. No flashy cover, no gripping tagline, just pages filled with quiet, dense sentences about thoughts and character, cause and effect. But as Christopher read, sentence by sentence, it felt like someone was holding a mirror up to his life. The book didn't talk about gangs or guns or drugs. It talked about seeds and harvests, about how the thoughts a person allows to grow in their mind eventually bloom into actions, habits, and fate. For the first time, he saw a straight line between the boy who had swallowed anger after his father was murdered, the teenager who chose the Bloods for belonging, the young man who numbed himself with liquor and cocaine, and the stranger who pulled a trigger in a convenience store. Reg didn't just hand him the book and walk away. He became a teacher, a big brother, a guide. Through metal and concrete, he taught Christopher how to breathe through rage instead of exploding with it. He challenged him to question every impulse, every belief about what it meant to be a man. They talked about responsibility, not the kind that blames the system for everything, but the kind that forces you to admit that no matter what was done to you, you still chose what you did to others. In a place designed to break people, their conversations built something instead. Then, in 2009, the state of Texas executed Reg. One day he was there, steady and present, and the next, his cell was empty. For Christopher, it felt like losing a brother and a mentor in the same heartbeat. The message from the system was brutal and clear. Growth doesn't guarantee survival. But instead of letting that kill whatever had started inside him, he made a decision. If the state could erase Reg's body, it would not erase what Reg had taught him. He would carry that torch forward, even if he was walking toward the same end. Years passed, measured not in birthdays or holidays, but in appeals denied and executions carried out down the hall. By 2018, the Christopher Young, who woke up each morning on death row, was almost unrecognizable from the 21-year-old who had walked into that store with a gun. Guards who had every reason to mistrust inmates found themselves relying on him. When tensions rose on the tier, when words started to sharpen into threats, he stepped in, not as a boss, but as a bridge. He talked men down, reminded them of what they stood to lose, even in a place where most had already lost almost everything. There was a day when a guard's life could have changed in a flash. An inmate snapped, the air shifted, and violence was seconds away. Christopher saw it. From behind his own door, with nothing to gain, he intervened. He used the respect he'd earned to calm things down, to keep blood from spilling. Another time, a man on the row decided he couldn't take it anymore. The walls were too close, the future too short. Christopher reached through the only tools he had, words through steel and concrete, and talked him back from the edge. In a place built to end lives, he was quietly helping to save them. Outside those walls, his daughters were growing up. 3 girls, trying to build their own lives with the knowledge that their father was both a killer and a man trying desperately not to die as one. He couldn't tuck them in or pick them up from school. All he had were letters and a few tightly controlled visits, so he poured himself into the only version of fatherhood left to him. He wrote to them about choices, about pain, about how easy it was to slide off the edge and how hard it was to climb back. He told them to use their minds, their voices, to never let the streets decide who they were. When they came to see him as teenagers, he held their hands as long as the guards allowed and told them the same thing, over and over. Be better than me. He didn't stop with his own children. He started writing to youth programs, churches, anyone who would take his words seriously. He drafted a curriculum from inside a cage, a program meant to reach young people before the gangs did, before the pain hardened into something deadly. He spoke honestly about the worst parts of himself, not to excuse them, but to warn others away from the path that had led him to a concrete box and a numbered execution date. For some, he became a cautionary tale with a human face, not just a mugshot on a news clip. Yet for all that, there was a line that change could not cross. On paper, in the eyes of the state, Christopher Young was still the same man who had raped a mother and murdered a store owner. That was the version of him that had been sentenced to die, and the legal system doesn't have a form to recognize who someone becomes 14 years later. Redemption makes for powerful speeches and moving letters. It does not, by itself, reopen closed cases. The day before his execution, another thread was added to this tangled story. The victim's son, Mitesh Patel, agreed to meet Christopher face to face. For years, people had wondered what he felt: hatred, grief, a desire for revenge, or something more complicated. In that small room, with glass and air and time between them, the man who had lost his father and the man who had taken him finally shared the same space. No cameras recorded every second. No transcript captured every word. What people know is simple. The meeting was emotional. Mitesh left in tears. From the outside, that image exploded into headlines about forgiveness and mercy. Stories painted a neat picture. The killer changed, the son forgave, the state killed him anyway. But the truth was messier. Mitesh never stood in front of microphones and clearly said, "I forgive him," or "I want his life spared." He didn't hold a press conference demanding clemency. All anyone really knew was that he walked into that room as a victim's son and walked out, deeply shaken. The media filled the silence with their own version of events, bending his sadness into a narrative of redemption that fit better on screens and in tweets. And so the question hangs there, sharp and unresolved. What did those tears mean? Was Mitesh Patel crying because he had seen genuine remorse and change in the man who murdered his father and didn't want the state to kill him too? Or was he crying because facing that man made the loss feel fresh again? Because it is devastating to see the human being behind the monster you've carried in your mind for years. Was it mercy, or was it grief that everything, the murder, the trauma, the hate, the slow transformation on death row, had all come too late? In the end, the system didn't care about the nuance. It didn't weigh the books read, the fights stopped, the letters written, the daughters counseled, the tears shed on both sides of the glass. It cared about the crime, the verdict, the sentence. Christopher Young had become a different man, but the world that judged him had already decided which version of him mattered. In the final stretch of Christopher Young's life, the fight stopped being just about what he did. It became a question of what his life was worth compared to someone else's. His lawyers knew the odds were almost zero, so they aimed their last shot straight at the heart of the system: race. 7 months before Christopher's execution date, the very same Texas board that would decide his fate faced another man on death row: Thomas Whitaker. Whitaker was white from a wealthy suburb, and his crime was horrific. He hadn't killed a stranger in a moment of chaos. He had planned the murder of his entire family. He arranged for hitmen to ambush them after dinner, shooting his mother, his brother, and his father. His mother and brother died. His father barely survived. It was cold, calculated, and personal. Yet when Whitaker's case came up, something rare happened. The board unanimously recommended clemency. The governor agreed. Whitaker's death sentence was changed to life in prison. Christopher's lawyers laid the two stories side by side like a grim comparison chart. On one side, a white man who tried to wipe out his own bloodline and lived. On the other, a black man who raped a woman and murdered a store owner and was scheduled to die. Same state, same board, same year. Different skin color, different ending. They argued that if mercy could exist for a man like Whitaker, then denying it to Christopher couldn't be explained by justice alone. They called it what they believed it was: racism hiding behind legal language. But the courts wanted something they could touch: emails, slurs, open confessions of bias. Without that, they held up their hands and said there was no direct evidence that race had driven the decisions. The numbers, the patterns, the gut-deep feeling that something was off were not enough. On his last full day alive, Christopher sat in front of the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles, the same group that had spared Whitaker. He didn't beg the way many expected. He didn't throw himself at their mercy. Instead, he challenged them. He talked about his past, his crime, but he also talked about who he had become, about the men he'd saved from violence, the guards he'd helped, the youth he'd tried to reach. Then he said out loud what everyone else was whispering: that a system which could spare a white man who annihilated his own family, but not a black man who had done less, was not a system blind to race. It was one that preferred not to see its own reflection. The board listened, faces flat, eyes unreadable. When they voted, it was unanimous. No commutation, no delay, no mercy. His attorneys rushed into federal court, filing emergency motions, arguing that Texas was about to carry out an execution soaked in racial inequality. The judge read their filings, heard their arguments, and by his own admission, felt troubled. But being troubled is not the same as being able to act. The law demanded proof of deliberate racial hatred, not just unequal outcomes. Without that, the judge said, his hands were tied. His order did not free Christopher. It cleared the path to the death chamber. By evening, the fight was over everywhere except inside Christopher's chest. He was transported to Huntsville, the site of countless Texas executions, and led into the small, sterile room that would be the last place he ever saw. He was strapped to the gurney, leather restraints tight across his arms and legs, his body displayed like evidence one final time. On the other side of the glass, witnesses gathered, officials, media, supporters, and members of the Patel family. The air was thick with decades of hurt, anger, and questions no one would ever fully answer. When they asked if he had any last words, Christopher didn't curse the state. He didn't lash out. He spoke to the people whose lives he had broken. He told the Patel family he was sorry, not in the distant, easy way of a man trying to save face, but in the trembling voice of someone who knew that apology could never be enough. He spoke to his daughters, to the 3 girls who had grown up with their father behind bars, and told them he loved them. He told them to live differently than he had, to choose a path that didn't end on a steel table under fluorescent lights. Then the executioners went to work. The IV line had already been set. The first drug entered his veins, then the second, then the third. As the chemicals burned their way through his blood, he managed to speak one more time. "It burns," he whispered, tears slipping from the corners of his eyes. His chest rose and fell a few more times, then slowed. In a matter of minutes, his body went still. His heart, which had spent 14 years learning a different rhythm, simply stopped. On the paperwork, it was simple, sentence carried out. But beneath that line lived a darker truth. Texas hadn't just killed the 21-year-old who had raped a woman and murdered a store owner. It had killed the 34-year-old who had become a mentor, a peacemaker, a father, trying to steer others away from the path that destroyed him. The man who walked into the mini food mart died morally a long time ago. The man who died on the gurney was someone else, someone the system claimed to want prisoners to become: remorseful, reflective, changed. In the end, none of that mattered. The state chose to punish who he had been, not who he was, and that is where the deepest controversy lies, not just in whether race played a role, not just in why one man lived while another died, but in what it means when a system that talks about rehabilitation refuses to recognize it when it finally appears. Here's the part that will keep you awake at night, gnawing at your conscience no matter which side you're on. Christopher Young was both things at once, a monster and a changed man. There's no clean way to separate them. He raped a woman while her children were close enough to hear. He shot an innocent store owner in the chest and left him to bleed out on the floor of his own dream. Those facts don't soften. They don't fade. But he also spent 14 years in a concrete cage, becoming exactly what society claims it wants: rehabilitated, remorseful, useful. He mentored inmates. He stopped violence. He wrote to at-risk kids and begged them not to become him. He became a father through letters and phone calls, pouring love and warnings into his daughter's ears, hoping they'd listen. So which version of him should have mattered when the state decided whether he lived or died? The question isn't just, did he deserve to die? That's too easy. People can shout yes or no and feel righteous either way. The real question cuts deeper and twists harder. What do we do with people who actually change? If the entire point of prison is supposed to be reform, if we lock people away with the hope that someday they'll become better, then why do we kill them the moment it works? Why do we demand remorse, personal growth, and accountability, and then execute the men who give it to us? Either we believe people can change, or we don't. But we can't have it both ways. We can't preach redemption and then act like it doesn't count when the person on the gurney is the proof. And if you want to pretend race had nothing to do with it, then explain Thomas Whitaker. Same state, same board, same year. A white man who hired hitmen to slaughter his entire family, his mother, his brother, his father. 2 dead, 1 barely alive. Premeditated, cold, calculated. The board spared him. They gave him life in prison instead of death. Christopher Young killed 1 person and raped another in a drug-fueled rampage. Horrible, absolutely. Worse than what Whitaker did? Debatable. Yet Whitaker is still breathing. And Christopher is in the ground. The system says there's no proof of racial bias, but when the outcomes split that cleanly along color lines, what exactly would proof look like? A signed confession from the board members? A leaked email with a slur in it? The pattern is the proof. The refusal to see it is the comfort. Then there's Mitesh Patel, the son of the man Christopher killed. He met Christopher the day before the execution. The room was small, the air was heavy, and when Mitesh walked out, he was crying. That image became a headline, a narrative, a symbol. But here's the part that should make you uncomfortable. Mitesh never publicly said he forgave Christopher. He never stood in front of cameras and demanded the state spare his life. All we know is that he left sad. So what does that sadness mean? Was it mercy? Was it grief? Was it the devastating realization that the man who destroyed his family had become someone worth grieving too? Or was it just the exhausting, suffocating truth that forgiveness is complicated, that even victims' families don't always agree on what justice looks like, and that pain doesn't follow a script? Christopher's 3 daughters are adults now. They lost their father twice. The first time when he walked into that store with a gun and threw away his future. The second time when the state strapped him to a table and stopped his heart. Hasmukh Patel's family lost him once, forever, in a pool of blood behind a counter. Both families are scarred. Both families carry wounds that will never fully close. And somewhere in between those 2 tragedies sits a system that swears it values rehabilitation, that claims it wants people to grow and change, but executes them anyway when they do. So here's what I need you to answer, and I don't care if it makes you uncomfortable. Was Christopher Young's execution justice, or was it revenge? Should a man be killed for who he was at 21, or should who he became at 34 matter? And if race played a role, if the color of his skin tipped the scales between life and death, why won't a single person in power admit it? Drop your answer in the comments, because this case is going to split you right down the middle. Some of you will say he got what he deserved. Others will say the system killed a man who had already died inside and been reborn into something better. Either way, you're going to have to sit with that choice. And if you want more cases like this, where the truth is uglier than the verdict,
his
and
brilliance
the questions don't
forgotten,
have easy answers,
his music
hit subscribe,
silent,
because we're going
his childhood
exactly where others
swallowed by the
refuse to
streets.
go.